I never thought I would reach a point where silence itself would start feeling like an answer. For most of my life, silence was something I controlled, something I used intentionally. A place where I could step away from expectations, from explanations, from the endless need people have to understand things before they accept them. I was comfortable there. In that space where nothing needed to be revealed, where I could exist without being examined, without being translated into something simpler. People usually think distance means a lack of connection. They assume that if someone keeps parts of themselves hidden, it means they don't want anyone close. But that was never the reason. Distant was never about keeping people away. It was about protecting what was real. Because once you allow someone to see deeper parts of you, you give them something most people don't know how to hold. And I've watched what happens when people misunderstand what they see. They don't just misunderstand a moment. They rebuild an entire version of you based on their own imagination. They take one piece, one reaction, one silence, one expression, and they create a story around it. A story that belongs more to them than it does to you. So I learned early, show enough to connect, hoe enough to remain yourself. That balance worked. Until you. The strange thing is, you never arrived like someone trying to enter my world. You didn't knock on doors. You didn't ask questions designed to uncover things. You didn't approach me like a puzzle that needed solving. And maybe that's why it felt different, because most people are drawn to mystery because they want the satisfaction of discovering it. You weren't interested in discovery. You were interested in understanding. There's a difference. Discovery is about finding something unknown. Understanding is about accepting something already there. And somehow, without trying, you did the one thing I never expected anyone to do. You noticed, not the obvious things, not the things anyone could see. You noticed the details people usually overlook, the pauses before I answered, the moments where I chose silence instead of words, the difference between when I was quiet, because I had nothing to say, and when I was quiet because I had too much. Most people hear words. You seem to notice everything around them. And that was unfamiliar, because I've spent years becoming good at controlling what people receive from me, the expression, the tone, the timing, the amount of truth given at any one moment. But around you, that process became less automatic, not because you demanded anything, because you didn't. And somehow that made it harder to hide. There's something powerful about being around someone who doesn't force you to reveal yourself. Someone who doesn't make your walls their challenge. Someone who doesn't see your boundaries as obstacles they need to overcome. You never tried to break through. You simply stayed present. And presence has a way of reaching places pressure never can. That was the first thing I noticed. Not that you understood me, but that you allowed me to exist without constantly trying to interpret me. There's a comfort in that which is difficult to explain, because being understood is rare, but being accepted before being fully understood is even rarer. And with you, it felt like I didn't have to prove the parts of myself that usually require explanation. I didn't have to justify why certain things affected me differently. I didn't have to explain why I process things internally before I speak. I didn't have to apologize for needing space while still caring deeply. You seem to understand that silence doesn't always mean absence. Sometimes silence means presence without performance, and that changed something, not suddenly, not dramatically, quietly, almost too quietly to notice at first. I started becoming less careful, not careless. There's a difference. Carelessness is losing awareness. This was losing the need for constant protection. The invisible filter between what I thought and what I allowed others to see started becoming thinner. And I didn't know whether to be concerned or grateful, because when you spend enough time protecting a part of yourself, you forget what it feels like when protection is no longer necessary. You start believing the walls are not walls anymore. You start believing they are simply who you are. Then someone comes along who doesn't remove them. They just make you question why they needed to exist in the first place. That was you. Not a disruption, not a force. A question, a quiet one, the kind that doesn't demand an immediate answer. The kind that stays with you. The kind that changes how you look at something you thought you already understood. And that's what made this complicated. Because I know how to deal with intensity. Intensity is obvious. It announces itself. It arrives loudly and gives you enough warning to prepare. But this wasn't intense. It was consistent. And consistency is harder to ignore. Anyone can create a moment. Anyone can create an impression. But patterns reveal something different. And the pattern with you was impossible not to notice. The way conversations didn't feel forced. The way silence didn't feel uncomfortable. The way I didn't feel the need to constantly adjust myself. There was no performance, no effort to become the version of myself I thought would be easier for someone else to understand. I was simply there, and somehow, that felt like enough. That feeling should have been simple, but it wasn't, because when something feels natural after being unfamiliar for so long, it creates a strange conflict. Part of you wants to move closer. Another part reminds you that anything meaningful carries risk, and I've always been someone who calculates risk carefully. I don't give access easily. I don't attach meaning quickly. I don't let temporary things occupy permanent spaces. But somehow, you started existing in a place I didn't consciously create for you. That was the part I couldn't explain. It wasn't that you became important because of something dramatic you did. It was almost the opposite. You became important because nothing dramatic was required. Your presence itself was enough. And that is something I still find difficult to understand, because the world teaches us to recognize impact through action, through events, through moments we can point to and say, that was when everything changed. But sometimes change happens without a moment. Sometimes it happens through repetition, through small interactions, through countless ordinary seconds, that quietly become something extraordinary. Maybe that's what happened here. Nothing announced itself. Nothing demanded attention. Something simply grew. And by the time I noticed it, it had already become part of my reality. That realization stayed with me. Because I'm used to noticing things before they affect me. I analyze. I observe. I understand patterns. That's how I maintain control. But with you, I found myself observing something that had already changed. I wasn't watching the beginning. I was noticing the result. And maybe that's why it felt so unfamiliar, because for once, I wasn't standing outside something trying to understand it. I was inside it, experiencing it, living with it. And that is a very different position to be in. Because understanding something from a distance gives you power. Being affected by something requires acceptance. And acceptance has never been the easiest thing for me. Not because I refuse it, because I know its weight. When I accept something, I don't do it halfway. I don't allow things into my life casually. If something reaches a certain level of importance, it stays. It becomes part of the structure. And structures are not easy to change. That's why I was careful. Not with you. With what this meant. Because I could feel the difference. I could feel that this wasn't just another connection that existed for a moment and disappeared when circumstances changed. There was something about it that felt rooted, something that didn't depend on constant interaction, something that existed even in absence. And that was the part that challenged everything I believed about connection. Because I always thought closeness was built through time, through experiences, through shared history, and maybe that's true for most things. But sometimes, two people recognize something in each other before they have enough history to explain why. Not because they know everything, but because something about the way they move through the world feels familiar, the way they think, the way they observe, the way they search for meaning beneath what is obvious. Maybe that's what this was. Not knowing every detail, not understanding every part, but recognizing the language someone speaks without words. And you spoke a language I didn't realize I knew. That's what made it difficult to ignore, because when something feels familiar in a world full of things that don't, you naturally pay attention. You wonder why. You search for the reason. You try to find the explanation. And maybe there isn't one. Maybe some things are not meant to be solved immediately. Maybe some things are meant to be experienced before they are defined. And that idea has always been difficult for me, because definition creates safety, names create boundaries, understanding creates control, but this existed before any of those things. It existed without asking permission, and somehow that was the most honest thing about it, because nothing about it was forced. Nothing about it was manufactured, it simply remained. And things that remain have a way of asking questions, questions you can avoid for a while, but not forever. And the question I kept avoiding was simple. Why does this feel like something I already know? Because the hardest things to explain are usually the things that feel the most obvious. That was the strange part about this. I didn't have to convince myself that something was happening. I didn't have to search for signs or create meaning where there was none. The awareness was already there. Quiet, persistent, almost impossible to separate from my own thoughts. And maybe that was what made it different. Most connections announce themselves through emotion, through excitement, through urgency. They arrive with a certain kind of noise. This didn't. This arrived through recognition, through the feeling that something about you made sense before I had enough information to explain why. And that is not something I knew how to handle, because emotions can be questioned. You can ask yourself if you are overthinking. You can ask if you are imagining things. You can ask if time will change the way you feel, but recognition is different. Recognition feels less like discovering something new and more like remembering something you somehow forgot. That was the feeling I couldn't ignore, like some part of me already understood the rhythm of your presence, the way you communicate, the way you react, the way you exist between moments. And maybe that's why I never felt the need to impress you. That's something I rarely notice about myself. With most people, there is always a level of adjustment, a small calculation, a question that exists somewhere in the background. How much of myself should I reveal here? What version of me belongs in this moment? What parts will be understood, and what parts will become too much? But with you, those questions became quieter, not because I suddenly became someone else, because I stopped feeling like I had to translate myself. And that is a rare kind of ease. The kind that doesn't come from having everything in common. The kind that comes from not needing to constantly explain what is different. You didn't need me to be predictable. You didn't need me to fit into an expectation. You allowed complexity to exist. And that is something most people struggle with. People like simple answers. They like knowing where they stand. They like putting things into categories, because categories make things easier to manage. But people are not categories. They are contradictions. They are unfinished thoughts. They are moments that don't always match the image others create of them. I have always been aware of that. Maybe that's why I became careful, because I know how easily people misunderstand what they don't immediately recognize. They mistake quietness for emptiness. They mistake independence for distance. They mistake observation for a lack of feeling. But you never seem to make those assumptions. You look deeper without trying to force depth. And that difference mattered, because there is a huge difference between someone who wants access to you and someone who respects your existence. One wants to take something, the other simply wants to understand. You were never trying to possess anything about me, you were just present with it. And somehow, that felt more powerful than any attempt to get closer, because closeness created through pressure never lasts. But closeness created through understanding has a different foundation. It doesn't need constant reassurance. It doesn't need proof every day. It simply exists. That's what made this difficult. Not the connection itself, the acceptance of it, because accepting something means admitting it has affected you. And I have always been careful about admitting when something reaches me. Not because I don't feel, because I do. Probably more than most people realize, but feeling something deeply means giving it importance. And importance creates responsibility. Once something matters, you cannot treat it casually anymore. You cannot pretend it has no impact. You cannot return to the same version of yourself that existed before it arrived. And that was the realization I kept coming back to. You had changed something, not externally, nothing obvious, nothing anyone else would immediately notice, but internally, in the place where thoughts form before they become words, in the place where decisions are made before they become actions. That place had changed, and I noticed because I know myself. I know my patterns. I know how I react to things. I know the difference between something temporary and something that leaves a mark. And this left a mark, not a wound, not a disruption, a mark, a reminder that something existed here, something meaningful, something that cannot simply be erased, because it doesn't fit into an easy explanation. That is what I struggled with, not whether it was real, but what reality meant afterward, because once you recognize something, you have a choice. You can acknowledge it, or you can avoid it. And avoidance has always been something I understood well. I know how to create distance. I know how to redirect attention. I know how to convince myself that something is less important than it feels. But the problem with this was that every attempt to minimize it made the truth clearer, because some things become louder when you try to silence them. And this was one of those things. The more I tried to place it into a normal category, the more obvious it became that it didn't belong there. It wasn't just interest. It wasn't just curiosity. It wasn't just comfort. Those words felt too small, too incomplete, because what existed here wasn't based on one specific thing. It wasn't one conversation, one moment, one memory. It was the accumulation of everything. The way small details connected, the way understanding appeared without explanation, the way your presence created a kind of calm that didn't come from escape. It came from being seen, and being seen is complicated, because everyone says they want to be understood, but very few people understand the vulnerability that comes with it. To be seen means there is less room to hide. It means the parts you carefully keep separate are no longer completely separate. Someone else has noticed them. Someone else has recognized them. And once that happens, pretending becomes harder. You cannot return to being invisible in the same way. That was the shift. You didn't make me reveal myself. You made me realize I was already revealing more than I thought. Through reactions, through silence, through the things I didn't say. And maybe that is what made you different. You weren't searching for information. You were paying attention to presence. Most people listen for answers. You listened for meaning, and there is a difference. Answers can be prepared. Meaning cannot. Meaning appears in the spaces people usually ignore. The pause before someone speaks. The hesitation before they admit something. The expression they make when they think nobody is watching. Those are the places where people reveal themselves. And somehow, you notice those places. Not because you were analyzing me, because you were aware. That awareness created something I wasn't prepared for. A connection without pressure, a closeness without demand, a feeling of being known without being exposed. And maybe that combination is what made it impossible to dismiss, because exposure feels unsafe. But being known feels different. Exposure means someone has access to something you didn't choose to give. Being known means someone understands something you were already willing to share. Even if you never said it directly, that distinction changed everything. Because for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I had to protect every part of myself. I could simply exist. And that is a strange kind of freedom, the kind you don't notice until you experience it. The kind that makes you question how much energy you spent maintaining walls that were never meant to be permanent. Maybe those walls were useful once. Maybe they protected something important. But maybe protection is not supposed to become a permanent state. Maybe there comes a point where keeping everything safe also keeps everything distant. And maybe you were the first person who made me question that, not by breaking through, by showing me what it feels like when there is no need to. That difference stays with me, because anyone can challenge your boundaries. Anyone can try to get closer, but someone who makes your boundaries feel unnecessary, that is different. That changes the entire equation. And that is where I found myself not losing control, finding a different kind of control. The kind where you are not constantly defending yourself, the kind where you can choose openness without feeling like you are sacrificing something. The kind where another person's presence does not feel like an interruption, it feels like an addition. And maybe that is what I was not prepared to accept, that something could enter my life without taking anything away from me, that someone could become important without becoming a threat, that closeness could exist without losing myself. Because for a long time, I believed those things could not exist together. I believed distance was the price of independence. I believed being fully understood meant giving someone too much power. But this changed that belief. Not through arguments, not through promises, through experience, through the simple reality of how different this felt. And when something changes the way you understand something you have believed for years, you pay attention. You have to, because maybe the most important moments in life are not the ones where everything changes around you. Maybe they are the ones where something inside you quietly changes its position, and you realize you are no longer standing where you were before. You have moved, even if nobody else can see it, even if you cannot explain exactly when it happened. You know, and I know, something shifted, something settled, something became real. And maybe the hardest truth to accept is that some things do not need permission to become important. They do not arrive with a warning. They do not wait until you are ready. They do not ask whether there is enough space for them in your life. They simply become part of it. That was the part I never learned how to prepare for. I knew how to deal with endings. I knew how to deal with distance. I knew how to recognize when something was temporary. There was comfort in that. Temporary things have limits. They have an ending point. They can be understood. But something that begins to feel permanent, something that slowly becomes part of the way you think, that is different, because permanence changes the way you approach something. You stop asking whether it matters. You start asking what responsibility comes with it, and that question is heavier, because recognizing something is one thing. Accepting what it requires from you is another. For a long time, I thought control meant never being affected. I thought strength meant remaining untouched, unmoved, independent from anything that could alter the way I existed. But maybe I misunderstood control. Maybe control is not about preventing things from reaching you. Maybe it is about choosing what you allow to remain once something does, and somehow you remained. Not because you forced your way into my life. Not because you demanded attention. Not because you became impossible to ignore through noise. You remained because silence itself started carrying your presence. That is something I still find difficult to explain. How someone can become noticeable without constantly being there. How someone can influence your thoughts without trying to. How someone can become familiar without years of history behind them. But maybe some connections are not built through time alone. Maybe some are built through depth, through the way two people understand things that others overlook, through the way they process the world. through the way they search for what exists beneath the obvious. And that was always the part that felt different. It was never about knowing everything about you. It was about recognizing something in the way you exist, a certain awareness, a certain way of noticing, a certain kind of quiet, the kind that does not come from having nothing to say, the kind that comes from having an entire world inside you. And maybe that is why your silence never felt empty, because I knew what silence could contain. I knew that sometimes the quietest people are carrying the loudest thoughts, the deepest emotions, the most complicated realities. Maybe that is why I never felt the need to fill every empty space with words. Because with you, empty space was never really empty. It had meaning. And meaning is something I have always valued more than expression. People often confuse communication with talking. But communication is not only what is spoken, sometimes it is what someone chooses not to say. Sometimes it is the patience they show when they could easily demand an answer. Sometimes it is the way they stay when leaving would be easier. And those things reveal more than words ever could. That is what you did. You showed understanding without needing to announce it. You showed care without turning it into a performance. You showed attention without making me feel observed. And that balance is rare, because attention can feel overwhelming when it comes from someone who wants something from you. But attention from someone who simply wants to understand feels different. It feels safe, and safety is not something I give easily, not because I do not value people, because I value what happens after trust is given. Once someone is allowed closer, they have the ability to affect parts of you that most people never reach. That is why I have always been selective, not distant selective. There is a difference. Distance says, I do not want anyone here. Selection says, not everyone belongs here. And I think that distinction explains a lot. Because you were not someone who convinced me to open the door. You were someone who made me realize the door was not as closed as I thought. And that realization was uncomfortable. Not because of you, because of what it revealed about me. It revealed that maybe I had become too comfortable protecting myself. Maybe I had confused peace with isolation. Maybe I had mistaken being untouched for being complete. And then you appeared, not to change who I was, but to show me another possibility. A possibility where connection does not mean losing yourself, where closeness does not mean weakness, where allowing someone to matter does not reduce your independence. That was something I needed to understand. Because I always believed that the more someone matters, the more power they have to hurt you. And that is true. But there is another truth beside it. The more someone matters, the more opportunity there is to experience something meaningful. Avoiding pain also means avoiding everything that makes life feel deeper. And maybe I had been avoiding more than I realized. Maybe I had become so focused on protecting my inner world that I forgot the purpose of having one. A world is not meant to remain untouched forever. It is meant to be experienced, shared, understood. And maybe that is what happened here. Not someone entering my world. Someone reminding me that my world could exist beyond me. That thought stayed with me, because I started noticing something else. I was not afraid of you. I was afraid of how naturally you fit. Fear usually comes from danger, but this fear came from something else, from the possibility that something could actually be right, and that is a different kind of fear. Because when something is wrong, leaving is easy. When something does not fit, you know what to do. You create distance, you protect yourself, you move forward. But when something fits, when something feels aligned, when something feels like it belongs, then leaving requires a reason, and I did not have one. I searched for one. I looked for the flaw, the reason to step away, the explanation that would make everything simpler. But every time I looked, I found the same thing. Nothing was forcing this. Nothing was unhealthy about it. Nothing about it required me to become less of myself. And that made it harder, Because sometimes we are not afraid of losing something. Sometimes we are afraid of admitting we found something. Finding something means you have to acknowledge its value. And acknowledging value creates a choice. You can protect it, or you can ignore it. But ignoring something meaningful does not make it disappear. It only creates distance between what you feel and what you accept. And I have never been someone who wants to live disconnected from the truth. Even when the truth is inconvenient, even when it changes things, especially then. Because I have always believed that understanding reality is better than hiding from it. And the reality was simple. Something about you reached a place I did not expect anyone to reach. Not because you forced your way there, because that place recognized you, and that was the part I could not explain. Recognition before explanation, comprehension before definition, understanding before words. It sounds impossible when you try to describe it, but some things are only confusing until you experience them. Then they become obvious, like hearing a song you have never heard before, but somehow knowing the feeling behind it, like entering a place for the first time and feeling strangely familiar with it, like meeting someone and realizing the conversation feels less like an introduction and more like a continuation. That was the feeling. Not that we had already lived the same story, but that we understood something similar, a similar way of seeing, a similar way of feeling, a similar way of existing. And maybe that is why this never felt forced, because forcing requires effort. This required awareness. It required noticing. It required accepting that sometimes the rarest connections are not the loudest ones. Sometimes they are the quiet ones that slowly become impossible to imagine life without. That is what changed. You became part of the background of my thoughts. Not an interruption, not a distraction, a presence. And there is a difference. A distraction pulls you away from yourself. A presence brings you closer to parts of yourself you forgot existed. That is what this became. Not an escape, a reflection, a reminder. A mirror showing me things I had stopped looking at. And maybe that is why this mattered. Because you did not create a version of me I had never seen. You revealed a version that was already there. The version that could trust without losing awareness. The version that could care without losing independence. The version that could allow someone close without feeling like something was being taken away. And once you see that version of yourself, you cannot pretend it does not exist. You cannot go back to believing you are incapable of something simply because you were careful for so long. Sometimes the right person does not change your identity. They change your understanding of it, and maybe that is what happened here. You did not become my world. You showed me that my world had more room than I thought, and that realization is something I cannot ignore anymore. And maybe that is where everything finally becomes clear. Not in the beginning. Not in the moments where I was trying to understand what was happening. Not in the countless times I questioned whether this was something temporary or something that deserved my attention. The clarity came when I realized I was no longer searching for an explanation. I was searching for acceptance, because somewhere along the way, I stopped asking why this existed. I started asking what I wanted to do with the fact that it did, and that is a completely different question. The first question comes from uncertainty. The second comes from awareness. And awareness requires honesty. The honest truth is that you became important without asking to be. You became a part of my thoughts without demanding space. You became someone I considered without needing a reason. And for someone like me, that means something, because I have never measured people by how much time they take from me. I measure them by what remains after they are gone, the conversations that stay, the thoughts that continue, the moments that return unexpectedly, the influence that exists even when there is no interaction. And with you, something remained. More than I expected, more than I was prepared for. It was never about needing you. That was never the point. Need has always felt like dependence to me, and dependence has always felt like losing a part of yourself. But this was different. This was not about becoming incomplete without someone. It was about realizing someone could exist beside your completeness. That distinction matters, because the strongest connections are not the ones where two people become one. They are the ones where two complete people choose to understand each other without possession, without control, without trying to reshape what already exists. And that is what made this feel different. There was no attempt to change me, no expectation that I should become easier to understand, no pressure to reveal everything at once. You allowed things to happen naturally. And maybe that is why they happened at all, because some parts of a person cannot be reached through effort. They can only be reached through safety, through patience, through the feeling that someone is not standing there, waiting for you to become something else. They are simply there, while you are becoming more yourself. That is rare. And rare things deserve attention, not because they are perfect. Nothing is perfect, but because they are real. And reality is something I have always valued, even when it is complicated, especially when it is complicated. I think that is what changed the most. Before you, I thought clarity meant having all the answers, knowing exactly what something was, understanding every possibility, predicting every outcome. But maybe clarity is not always about knowing everything. Maybe sometimes clarity is simply recognizing what matters, even when you do not know where it leads, even when there are unanswered questions, even when the future is uncertain, because uncertainty does not always mean something is wrong. Sometimes uncertainty means something is alive, something is still unfolding, something has not reached its final form yet, and maybe that is where we are. Not at an ending, not at a conclusion, but at the point where pretending becomes impossible, the point where silence has already said enough, the point where ignoring something requires more energy than accepting it. And I think that is what I finally understand. I was never afraid of what this was. I was afraid of admitting that it mattered, because once something matters, you cannot treat it like everything else. You cannot casually walk away. You cannot reduce it to something smaller, just because something smaller would be easier to handle. You have to respect its existence. You have to respect the effect it has had. And this has had an effect. It has changed the way I see certain things, the way I approach connection, the way I understand trust, the way I think about allowing someone close. You showed me that closeness does not always come with a cost, that being understood does not always mean being exposed, that letting someone see you does not automatically mean losing control. Sometimes it means gaining a different kind of freedom, the freedom to stop constantly protecting every part of yourself, the freedom to exist without always preparing for misunderstanding, the freedom to be known without feeling like you have given something away. And maybe that is the greatest thing about this. You never took anything from me. You never asked me to become less independent, less thoughtful, less careful. You never asked me to change the parts of myself that took years to build. You simply showed me that those parts did not have to keep everyone out, that they could exist alongside connection, alongside trust, alongside something meaningful. And that changed the way I see everything. Because maybe walls are not always proof of strength. Sometimes they are proof that something inside was worth protecting. But protection has a purpose. It is not meant to become a prison. And maybe I forgot that. Maybe I became so focused on keeping everything safe that I forgot some things are only valuable because they are experienced, because they are shared, because they are allowed to exist beyond yourself. That is what you reminded me of. Not through words, through presence, through consistency, through the way you existed without needing to prove anything. And that is why this feels different, because the strongest things are not always the things that arrive dramatically. Sometimes they are the things that quietly become undeniable, the things you notice only after they have already changed you, the things that do not demand a place in your life, because somehow they already have one. That is what happened here. You became part of a space I never expected anyone to reach, not because you crossed a boundary, because I realized I wanted the boundary to move. And there is a difference. A huge one. Because allowing someone closer is not weakness. Choosing someone is not losing yourself. Caring about something does not make you less powerful. It simply proves that power was never about being unaffected. Maybe power is being able to feel something deeply and still remain yourself. Maybe strength is not building higher walls. Maybe strength is knowing when something is worth opening the door for. And if there is one thing I know now, it is this. Whatever this becomes, it has already been meaningful, not because of what it promises, not because of what it might become, because of what it already changed. The way I think, the way I understand myself, the way I see connection, the way I recognize what feels genuine. And maybe that is enough. Maybe not everything meaningful needs an immediate definition. Maybe not everything real needs a label before it can exist. Some things simply need honesty. And the honest truth is this: I noticed you, then I understood you, then somewhere between those two things, I started seeing parts of myself differently. And that is not something that happens often. That is not something I take lightly. So, if this continues, I do not want it to continue because we are afraid to let go. I want it to continue because we are aware of what it is, because we choose it, because we recognize its value, because something about it feels worth protecting, not out of fear, out of respect. And maybe that is the difference between holding on to something and choosing something. Holding on comes from fear of losing. Choosing comes from understanding what you have. And I understand now. I understand why this felt different, why it stayed, why it mattered, why no amount of distance could make it feel insignificant. Because some people enter your life and become memories. Some people enter your life and become lessons. And some rare people enter your life and become part of the way you see everything afterward. You became that. Not because you changed who I was, because you helped me see who I already was. And maybe that is the most unexpected part of all. The fact that the person who made me feel understood also made me understand myself better. The person who never tried to break my walls made me question why I needed them so much. The person who never asked for a place in my world somehow became someone I naturally made room for, and that says more than any explanation ever could. So no, I do not know exactly what comes next. I do not know what shape this takes. I do not know where every path leads. But I know one thing. I will not pretend this was nothing. I will not reduce it, because it is easier. I will not ignore something that changed the way I exist, because some things deserve to be acknowledged. Some people deserve to be recognized, and some connections deserve the honesty of being seen for what they are. This is one of them. Not because it is perfect, not because it is effortless, but because it is real. And after everything I have spent years protecting myself from, something real was always the one thing worth letting in.